One night, when I was doing math homework, I overheard something on the TV in another room talking about a train that got stuck in a tunnel and was filling with a mysterious gas quickly. That piqued my interest, so I rushed to finish my homework on shit that didn't matter to look at another work that didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Little did I know at the time, however, that this would take me down a path where I would spend over a decade trying to locate all the episodes after it left syndication, this show being Disasters of the Century. Yeah, a bit of a left turn, I imagine. David having an interest in these kind of documentaries? Well, hey, I grew up on GTA 1 as a child, and I turned out okay. So anyways, why am I talking about this show today? No real reason. I just got bored and figured I'd hyperfixate, or whatever the fucking term is the young ones say nowadays, for a bit. Now, with a title like Disasters of the Century, there wasn't a lot of information I could get my hands on when it came to production, or even when the show was actually aired. Some sources say 2000, others say 2001, fucking IMDb lists it starting from 2002 to 2005. At the very least, we know the show goes past 2003 in terms of its original airing, as it talks about the 2003 BC fires, as well as Hurricane Juan. Now, going off what I just said, you probably have an idea of what the show's about, but since I have a checklist with Phil, I'll go over it anyway. What do you mean that wasn't supposed to be set up? So each episode talks about a disaster from the 20th century, save for a couple exceptions like the aforementioned BC fires and Hurricane Juan. From the lead up to the event to even actions taken after the disaster, each episode gives you a basic rundown of how fucked up this moment in history was. Some episodes will feature survivors of the event talking about where they were when it happened and their personal experiences before and after the disasters. Some will feature just historians if it's a case where no one survived or if it occurred really early in the 20th century, and some will have descendants/siblings of those involved, and this is an element of the series I liked. It's one thing to get told what happened, like you were being told about it in, say, history class, but bringing in the survivors/historians' experience makes the retelling more personal/emotional, since it brings in that human element and reminds you that people were actually hurt during these points in history. Some people had to bury their loved ones far too soon or lose their homes because of factors out of their control. Some had to fight for their lives. It also gives you a chance to empathize with the survivors or families of the victims before the tragedy hits, and figuratively throws you through an emotional roller coaster until the disaster ends and you see how they were affected and or them putting their lives back together. An element that unfortunately is almost non-existent nowadays with a lot of online documentaries on tragedies. But I digress. The show does a really good job at covering a wide range of topics, from avalanches to volcanic eruptions, storms to mining accidents and landslides. You got your airplane crashes, and as the series goes on, they do cover incidents outside of Canada, such as the Kanto earthquake, the Opao disaster, and the Nicaragua earthquake, as well as the Pele eruption. Now, this isn't the only show to do this. Seconds from Disaster also did this, as did Blueprints for Disaster and Seismic Seconds, for the two people that remember that show. But the variety is an element that I liked about this show, since it prevents the show from feeling samey because, more than one type of disaster occurred in history. I'm also a sucker for practical effects, so seeing them use model trains and the like over CG is a nice touch. Though they do use CGI at numerous points in the series, and yeah, you could tell this was an early 2000s production. Hell, some of these look like something you'd see on Windows 95. It's good, though, that we have gotten better with using technology in CG since the 90s, because we wouldn't have gotten to where we are now if it wasn't for these attempts. Yeah, of course they look dated now, but for the time, these looked great, and did ultimately serve as a great stepping stone for us to use in order to make things better in the present for CG and the like. Now we're just competing over which grains of sand look slightly more shiny than the other, or which hyper-realistic human will age worse in 2 years as technology speeds past us. The CG definitely hasn't aged well in 2034/2024 for other realities, but for the time, this looked great, and we wouldn't likely have great C if it wasn't for stuff like this. The narration by Bruce Edwards is also really good. Very informative, but also able to keep your attention with the way he talks.
There is almost no way to get to the men. Desperate, many do anything to be saved.
Make read a fucking phone book and make that sound interesting, so kudos on that part. While the show is very informative and has a good variety of topics to discuss regarding the 20th century, sometimes they do spread misinformation and or are incorrect about history. Now, some stuff, like information coming out after these episodes aired, is not what I'm referring to. That's just a case of hindsight, such as this.
No permanent memorial of granite or steel exists to recall the day when disaster struck on a holiday weekend.
Or another instance being information on the HMS Thetis that came out in 2009 that explains why they didn't just cut holes into the Thetis to give them more air or attempt to free them with a larger hole when that portion of the sub was out of the water for a lengthy period of time. With those two cases, like I said, that's a case of hindsight, since those two pieces came out after these episodes were aired. What I'm referring to is information that was available around the time or years before these episodes were even aired. So, I'm gonna go down the list.
Louis Auguste Cyprius concentrates on keeping out of sight. He is at large after escaping from the Martinique jail a few days before.
I looked into this and I found nothing to verify this claim. The most I found were claims that he was arrested the night before the eruption for inappropriate behavior / fighting while drunk.
In an effort to convince citizens that Montpellier is not dangerous, Governor Moutet, along with his wife and Secretary of State, make an excursion to the summit for a personal inspection.
Like the last point, I have no idea where this claim came from, but from what I have looked into, it paints quite the opposite picture. The governor did visit St. Pierre to ensure the citizens that everything was fine, but he did not travel up the summit the day of the disaster. Hell, historians can't even make up their minds on how Moutet died. Some say he drowned, some say he was in the lahar that destroyed the city. This one claims to die on the way up the fucking summit. At this rate, if you told me he died from chewing a steak wrong, I'd fucking believe you. No one can keep their story straight. Also, small note.
He and Cyprius are all that remain of the population of St. Pierre.
When there were actually a few more survivors, including a little girl that hid in a cave.
In point of fact, and this was later determined to be the case, what actually started the fire was a big short circuit in an overfused line behind the false wall.
Again, I ask, where the fuck is this claim coming from? Is this from the dimension where the Island Boys didn't kiss each other? First off, the busboy was found not guilty because they couldn't pinpoint the cause of the fire. Secondly, this bit about the wiring is a theory because, as mentioned previously, they couldn't pinpoint the cause.
Concerned about the older munitions' volatility, Captain John Beeling makes a request to have the World War II ordnance removed from his ship.
While yes, they knew the bombs were a risk, there is no evidence supporting them wanting to remove the bombs. In fact, there's evidence stating that they literally had no choice but to use the bombs due to a shortage.
Upon ignition, flame fires from the engine of the A-4 Seahawk in what is known as a hot start. The flame ignites a missile on the wing of the plane behind it.
So remember that source I used a moment ago? Yeah, I get to use it again. It wasn't caused by a hot start. It was an electrical short circuit that caused the missile to fire. And a pigtail was also supposed to be used to protect the circuit, but that was removed because it would slow down the launch rate. Alright, one more episode, and this is something I see way too often with videos that talk about this tragedy.
Heavy oil empties into the sea from the ship's hold. Icy seawater rushes in, flooding the engine and boiler rooms. The boilers explode, killing passengers and trapping many more in the lower decks.
This is a major misconception I continue to see even nowadays.
Seawater getting into the engine room caused a massive boiler explosion, as fuel tanks were ripped open and dumped hundreds of gallons of fuel into the sea.
No. The Sophia's boilers did not explode. Not only because if it did, some of the victims would have the effects of either steam burns from the explosion or would have shrapnel in them due to the explosion, and most of the autopsies determined they died from drowning or suffocating due to swallowing oil. Well, the other major thing is that divers have gone to the Sophia wreck multiple times since the disaster and found the boilers perfectly fine. Actually, wait a minute.
While he doesn't find Eileen Winchell, the diver does uncover more bodies trapped below.
So, in the area where the explosion took place, the diver went down there and didn't notice that, hey, there's no sign of an explosion here. Or, hey, these engines are still intact. He was able to find some of the bodies in that section. Give me a break. So where did this claim even come from? Well, some sources claim it was from this book, The Sinking of the Princess Sophia, Taking the North Down With Her, which was released in 1991. And after borrowing a copy, I found the claim in question. It was a guess from the author's end.
You fucking idiot!
Now, luckily, these mistakes are few and far between, so it doesn't ruin the show for me, nor does it make everything stated in said show incorrect. I only brought it up to state that it's not perfect. Nothing is, after all. But despite these issues, it's still a great series, documenting the worst disasters in history, while also showcasing that things have improved since those dark days. Speaking of dark days, let's talk about that decade-long journey I mentioned at the start. So after the show left syndication around the late 2000s, early 2010s, there were a few episodes that I wanted to rewatch. So after my attempts at scouring other channels failed, I turned to the internet.
There's a little note on the table.
And in my lengthy search, I found one episode. The Opau disaster. I attempted to keep looking for more, and I was able to find one DVD that had 2 episodes on it, but outside of that, the search ran cold. Then around 2018, I found an episode on YouTube that was posted in 2016, and it turns out that this channel was the place where they were officially re-uploading the older episodes of the series, which was really cool to see. I'm glad the original episodes are up for preservation's sake, since it gives those who used to watch the series a chance to see it again, And it also gives a chance for newcomers to learn about these moments in history in a similar lens that a lot of us did back when the show was airing in the 2000s. It's not a perfect series, nothing is, but it was a great way to learn about these moments in history while also not glorifying the tragedy and adding in how they moved forward from it all, as well as what lessons were learned from the disaster and the sense of humanity coming together during those tough times to help one another. But that's just me. Anyways, that concludes this review. I'm David Grimm, and thank you for watching.
What did you say his power level is?
It's over 9,000.